second step in preparing beeswax, how I do it. And of course, this is a very small time operation. I have 50 hives. You know, I probably get, I have no idea how much wax I get, but it's probably on the order of 40 pounds, which is a lot of wax, but you know, major beekeepers get a lot more than that. This is how it came out of the solar extractor. All right, so this is a decent melt, and but not a great one. I mean, in fact, usually I get much better than that. But it's in the fall now. The days are shorter for one, and they're cooler for two. So as the wax hit the water in this particular mold, the wax solidified. The water never got to above 140 degrees. So typically you get a nice water wax separation and a nice block, but this one didn't happen. It doesn't matter. The goal was accomplished. You separated the honey from the wax and most of the propolis as well. So this is pretty pure honey, really, or beeswax. This is pretty pure beeswax, actually. But what I did here is I put water in the bottom of this pan, and I want the water in there. I'm going to melt the wax until it's fully molten, and then I'm going to pour it back into the same mold that these came out of together, because you know, it's easier to work in larger quantities of beeswax if you can. So I'm going to pour this back into that same mold, and the water is going to do the same thing. The wax is going to float on the water. Any honey that's left in there, and there is some, but very little, will mix with the water, and the propolis will cake to the very bottom of the mold. So this is the second process. You just melt wax with water, pour it into another mold and let it separate, and then you can go on to the final process. So okay, you can see it's all melted in there. If you're not sure if it's all melted, just get a stick that you only use for beekeeping or for beeswax processing, and stir it a little bit in there, and you'll be able to feel if there are any chunks. So what I'm going to do next is just pour this into a mold, which I have set up right here, and the water is going to sink to the bottom, and then the wax to the top, and everything in between is going to go in between. So, but just pour it in there. The wax is going to go in first, and then the water. And you'll see all the propolis and everything coming out of there. And you just, now you'll let this sit for a few hours. What you don't want, since the water maintains its heat for so long, it takes a very long time for the wax underneath the very bottom part of the wax that's against the water to cool. So you need this to be absolutely cool to the touch on the sides, and again, don't disturb it. You can see that just in the time I've been talking, there's a bead of wax around the edges of the mold that's re-solidified, and you can see it starting to form, you know. But it'll stay like this for a little while, and then everything will separate, and I'll show you what happens when it's done. It's literally been just a couple minutes, maybe 3 minutes, since I poured this in the last part of the video, and you can see that the sediment is at the very bottom there. And it may stay at the bottom in the water, which would be great, or it may stick to the bottom of the wax. But either way, you know, it's going to be separated in a large part from the wax. And what isn't separated will be in the next step when we prepare the final melt there. Okay, it has been a number of hours since I poured this, and if you tilt it, you can see the water and the honey mix, and even some of the propolis come out. So all we need to do now is separate that and dry it. Okay, so the easiest way I think to do this is just to, first of all, just tilt it and get as much of the water out of the pan as you can. That leaves a cavity underneath. And then I usually just kind of move it around a little bit, pop it out. You can see the propolis on the bottom. It's easier if you scrape that off. Don't do it in your kitchen sink. But what I'm going to do is take a towel and rub that off and get it dry at the same time, because on the next melt you don't want any water in your next melt. So make sure it's completely dry before you start the next process. But that is a nice big block of wax, and most of it is very, very pure. The propolis is on the bottom of it. Okay, like I said, just kind of rub as much of this off as you can. The more you get off, the easier it'll be in the next phase. And you can actually scrape all of this off and you have almost pure beeswax, but I don't typically do that all. I try to salvage as much of this beeswax as possible. But again, you know, if you're going to throw this right away in there and start, you know, going to the next phase, which I'll show you, you'll want to dry it completely. You do not want water in the next process. So that's about as good as I'll get it, and the rest I'll filter out when I do the next process. However, I'm not going to do it with this one. I'm just going to store this for now. Okay, to prepare to filter your wax, I just have an empty kettle. Of course, I've used it before, so there's, you know, wax in there before. But this is actually use a clean. Like I said, I think somewhere else in the video, I use a clean and then a dirty wax, you know, pot. So this one is my clean wax. The only thing I ever put in here is clean wax, or wax that is being filtered. So I just took a t-shirt, old sweatshirt, whatever. Sweatshirts work really good, and then or t-shirts to filter this out. Cheesecloth doesn't work as well as you'd think. It's just not fine enough. Some of the propolis gets through there. And I just take rubber bands and I put it on there, and then I create, you know, a little bit of a bowl for pouring the wax in. I angle it a little bit if I can. This one's angled a little that way. So a lot of the propolis is going to go here, but once the wax starts to fill up, then the foreign material will start sticking to the outside here. So that's how you prepare that. And the only other thing you have to do is heat up that block of wax, and then we'll start pouring it through. Okay, so the next process after this is fully dried, and again, you really don't want any water in this. And the reason is because the water will stay in here, and it will separate just like it did before. And when it does, and you pour it into your mold, the water is going to sink to the bottom. It's going to create little bubbles because the water will evaporate once you separate it from the mold. So you want this completely dry. I had to take a compressor and, you know, blow the air out of that crack that happened in the wax there. So then you want to take the same pot. It's still the dirty one. Take that and melt this down. You know, all the way. So there's no water in here now. It's just a block of wax, but I'm still using a double boiler because you always want to keep water between the wax and the flame. This part of the process is pretty easy. You just melt this down, and then we're going to pour it through a filter, and after that you'll have pure beeswax. Okay, the first thing I need to do is warm up this filter just a little bit. So I got a heat gun here. It'll only take a second, but you want to heat up the filter just a little bit, because otherwise, as soon as the wax hits it, it's going to cool. And although the wax that is following it up will, you know, subsequently melt that wax, it does cause a little bit of a process where it puts a damper on things. So heat this up a little bit, and then take your wax directly off the flame and pour it through the filter. And I've found that when you do this, you want to try to get as much, you can hear the wax going through the filter there, as much, so I keep it almost full there, and then I just adjust how much I'm going in there to how much is going out. You don't want to let it drip over, but you also want to put a little bit of pressure, you know, in the form of weight of this wax on there, so that it actually pushes it through there a little bit. And it takes a little, so, you know, the bigger the filter, the faster this will go. I use a very, a t-shirt basically, so it's pretty fine. And if it gets to the point where the stuff in your pot starts to re-solidify, you can always put it back on the warm water and use a heat gun to keep this warm until it goes down just a little bit. But as you can see, most of the stuff coming out of here is clean up to this point, and now you see some darker stuff come through. So that's on the bottom. So I kind of move it around just a little bit. At least I try to, because you don't want to. It helps to keep the filter from clogging. And then I use two methods. I'll show both of them to you, but I'm almost done here. Basically, here's all the junk, most of it. It doesn't matter, you can always heat this up so it stops flowing. You can always heat that up and wipe it out with a paper towel. That's what I usually do. But then to keep that flowing, just turn your heat gun back on and just kind of hit it with your heat gun. And that does one of two things. It heats it up, obviously, and it also gives it a little bit of pressure to go through that filter. And then as it gets lower and lower, you can get closer and re-melt the stuff on the edge there. Some of which will get soaked into the cloth, and some of which will go through. So. And the other way is I put it back on the heat, which I left on, that hot water. Putting it back on there helps as well. I'll show you that. So I just put it back on the stove, and you can see that it's going to keep this warm up here. You'll still need a heat gun, I usually do anyway. But it also is reliquefying the wax that fell in there, that filtered through this. It's reliquefying it because as soon as you pull this filter off, that's when I'm going to pour it into my molds over here. Okay, I've taken off the filter, and there is the final product. You can, most of the time, beeswax is pretty clear when it's molten like that. And you can look down through and see if you filtered out most of the material before you actually pour it into the final product. And it looked pretty clear to me. So, and then remember, this is capping, so it's about as clear as it gets. So the next thing I'm gonna do is pour it into the mold. So I will try not to get in the way. And remember that as you're pouring this, beeswax starts to solidify fairly quick, so you don't have an extremely long amount of time. But and this is a very inexact way to measure beeswax, of course, but I'm just a tiny operation. And once you kind of start seeing the wax go around the edges, you're there. And just remember that the wax, you can see the stuff that hit on the side, maybe you can see, is already solidified. So I try to get these blocks as full as they'll go without flowing over, but they're supposed to be 1 ounce blocks of wax, and so that's what I sell them as. Also, as you're pouring this, you can tell if there's sediment in there, and there really wasn't. You can see the tone difference. You can see the change in color just because of the amount of beeswax in each sample. But that is your final product. You've poured it into your mold. You can do this, of course, you can wick up a candle and pour it into the candle mold and then leave it. But what you do want to do is not disturb it now. So in these square molds, if it recedes a little bit, it's okay with me. I'm just measuring out basically 1 pound and 1 ounce. Or in that case 5 ounces. But in a candle, what might happen is as the beeswax starts to cool, it shrinks just a little bit, And it's good for it to shrink in a mold like this because that helps me get it out of the mold, and it does in a candle as well. But what happens is you get a bowl-shaped thing on the bottom. So keep some wax, liquid when you're pouring into a candle mold, and then just add a little bit once it shrinks a tiny bit. Just add a little bit. You can also, it helps to maybe stir it with a little tiny, stick or something in a candle mold. But in this case, I'm just making it to sell or to use in my own operation so that it's easily measured out in ounces or pounds, depending on what I'm making. So that is the final product right there, and I'll show you once it cools. But you want to leave it cool. You don't want to create excessive vibration around this area because this big block will crack if it gets vibration once it's started to settle a little bit. This is what she'll look like after just a few minutes. You can see the wax starting to cool on the top. This stuff is already completely cooled over, and if you can see it, there's a darker color underneath it, so it's still molten in the middle. But that's what it kind of will look like. Okay, it's probably been an hour or so since I poured this in my video, and while it's not completely, absolutely dry, or cool, I should say, it is enough that you can pull this out. So sometimes if you over pulled a little bit, or if you over poured a little bit, you'll have these little tabs on there. I just break them off and I put them back in the same container that I poured it. This is extremely, clean wax, and you can just re-pour it. But since these 1 ounce blocks take so much, so much less time to cool, to the point where you can pull them out of the mold, it is, it's one of those things you can do, that you can pour 3 or 4 of these in the time that it takes you to pour a 1 pound block. And these sell a lot better because people usually measure the amount of wax that they're using in a recipe by ounces usually. So it's easier for them. Okay, and here's the wax that came out of the mold. It took about an hour and 15 minutes probably. Hour and 10, hour and 15 minutes or something. You can see it's still a little soft on the top. Usually I leave them in overnight or for at least 3-4 hours, but just to complete this video I wanted to pop it out of there. And you can feel on the mold whether or not it's ready to come out or not, but there you have it. This is still warm to the touch, and but it'll cool actually faster now that I got it out. And if you're ready to, if you're in a hurry to do that so you can pour another block, it works that way too. So there's the final product. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Hope it was informative anyway. I'm sure that everybody's process is going to be slightly different. So, some parts of it will be, I'm sure you'll be able to improve on the process too. So hope this helps.